In 1929, Hitchcock and Johnson proclaimed the International style, a text and an exhibit often celebrated as the advent of the modern architecture discourse in America. In fact, the enunciation of the modern style ipso facto compromised an exploratory sensibility that was at the time fragile, experimental, and ambiguous. Modern as style killed modern as speculative, and New York MoMA reigned as modern architecture's supreme regulatory agency. Here's how you do it, kid. Clean, straight, stripped, ribbon windows, white walls, honest structure, a pro forma complete with ethics. And most important, a new idol, the obligatory expression of technical prowess, the machine as new freedom, and the machine image as architecture's up-to-date analog. Want to be a radical architect? Just follow these rules, kid. Chapter 1, next, Wendy. Most architects believe windmills are simply windmills. The 16th century Spanish architect Don Quixote de la Mancha announced the contrary. When windmills are menacing ogres, new architecture appears. Then Quixote attacked. Sancho Panza, yet another pragmatic populist, disclaimed Don's charge. Sancho and his colleagues saw only windmills. Zaha and Patrick are students of Quixote. Chapter 2. Next image. The 19th century German design theoretician George Hegel proposed a chronology for reading the history of architecture. How architecture explains itself to itself is a variable, Hegel said, and that variation follows a pattern. Here it is: the thesis, the antithesis, and the synthesis. Zaha and Patrick, Hegelian acolytes, remodeled Hegel's hypothesis as follows: the modern thesis, followed by the deconstructed antithesis, concluded by the parametric synthesis. Chapter 3. We write the history of architecture, and the history of architecture becomes the history we write. And the parametric synthesis is our current chapter. Or is it? What's parametric? An interrelationship of multiple components in which the evolving condition of each component is perpetually re-scripted by the evolving conditions of each of the other components as they continuously re-relate to one another. Sounds like kinetic concrete. Ergo, modern MoMA as static, parametric Patrick as dynamic, and dynamism and parametric as synonyms. Or are they? Epilogue. Invention in architecture isn't an analog to scientific discovery. Architects don't discover what's so. Architects invent what's so if they can. It's not what's intrinsic to building conception, it's what's extrinsic. What we say is so if we imagine an alternative way to think and to see. and then construct it. Zaha and Patrick are doing just that. A new idea, a new idol. No idol or no ideal. Next slide. Please welcome Philip Johnson, Don Quixote, George Hegel, Zaha Hadid, and Patrick Schumacher to SCI-Arc.
Thanks. Well, it's great to be here, and I had 2 great days yesterday to see what's going on here. And I think what I have to say speaks to what's going on here to a certain extent critically. The lecture is a kind of extension and variation of the lecture I've been giving a few places over the last year. And I've added an element to it, which relates to a book which is coming out early December, The Autopoiesis of Architecture, which is an attempt to create a comprehensive and unified theory of architecture, within which parametricism features as the last chapter of Volume 2. And the argument is that parametricism continues the autopoiesis of architecture, which is the self-referentially closed system of communications that is architecture as a discourse within contemporary society. This is just the way these 2 volumes will appear. Volume 1 is coming out, as I said, in December. A new framework for architecture, and then a new agenda for architecture in Volume 2, I think going to be about 4 to 6 months later. And I will just trying to raise a bit of curiosity about this. It's difficult to present this in summary, but I will make an argument why such a book or comprehensive unified theory is of interest. It's a comprehensive unified theory of and for architecture to lead the way. And I realized that if you trying to lead 400 architects across a multiplicity of projects touching all components of contemporary architecture in terms of programmatic agendas and all scales, one is better well prepared to avoid that the different designs, designers and approaches all run into different directions, fight each other, contradict each other and stand in each other's way. But more than that, I'm also teaching in a number of schools, and DOL at the A being one of them, is expanding to a group of, which at the overlap period is now 150, 160 students. And again here, there is an issue in trying to cohere and converge efforts so that they don't trip over each other and get in each other's way, if you like. The need for unified theory is, first of all, to eliminate contradiction within one's own efforts, that one doesn't stand in one's own way all the time. If you go around from jury to jury, from project to project, you say one thing here, another thing there, and a further idea comes to mind. And the third occasion, you might be saying things and doing things which don't gel, don't cohere. And you might be developing ideas about architecture's societal function. You might be concerned about what is architecture and what is not architecture, to demarcate architecture against art, engineering, etc. You might think about, is there something like an avant-garde, and try to develop a theory of the avant-garde. You're thinking about design media and their role. Medium theory, you think about design processes theory. You wonder about aesthetic values and the notion of beauty, if it's still relevant. So you trying to develop a theory of beauty and an aesthetic theory. Then you concerned with phenomenology, phenomenology of perception, how do you perceive space, subjects in space. Semiology is another aspect which has been kind of a backwater and denigrated. And so it goes on. The concept of style, is it still relevant? You're trying to develop a theory of style. You try to read history of architecture in a certain fashion. And you're trying all this to position yourself with respect to contemporary architecture. And these are the components which different authors, different thinkers might do and spend half of their career on. Some of us might do two or three of these. But at a certain stage, it makes sense to think whether these things can be brought into a coherent system of ideas where these things forge a kind of trajectory, and that has to do with guiding practice. You can only lead coherent practice with a deep and comprehensive coherent theory. As I said, otherwise you deny and reject, contradict and backtrack on something, for instance, the domain of design process theory, what stands in the way of what your ideas might have been about aesthetic theory, etc., and so from project to project. So I think there's a need for such unified theory. There's nobody who's been attempting this since Le Corbusier and perhaps also the book International Style, if you like. Some other attempts, maybe Christian Norberg Schulz. But for a long time this has been a kind of nearly taboo to even start thinking about such. And I think to single out, to kind of mention the book International Style, I do find it very interesting and exciting that the concept of style was brought back. But I think what Eric has been talking about with respect to this treatise could have equally been leveled against Le Corbusier's Towards the New Architecture, which is the last, and the two of them perhaps, coherent self-description of architecture with forward drive, and it dominated the transformation of this planet in terms of the built environment for 50 years and generating an enormous level of material freedom and plenty, which is unprecedented, aligned with, of course, industrial civilization. Of course, we know that this went into crisis, and this moment of crisis meant that free-reigning, freewheeling, browsing, brainstorming had to take place, bringing forth a new set of characters. But doesn't mean that forever a kind of attempt to cohere and converge and project forward in a coherent way is to be denied. This is just, again, perhaps to impress a little bit and to raise curiosity, the chapter structure of Volume 1. After the introduction, it is architectural theory, which is first theorized and put forward as an important necessary component of architecture. It actually marks the inception and origin of architecture 500 years ago in the early Renaissance with Alberti. That's where I say architecture starts. Everything before that was not architecture, it was some kind of form of traditional building. Just clicking through some of these. Most of this book is in fact an attempt to observe architecture and its communication structures, key principles, distinctions, methodological principles, practices. It's a kind of comprehensive discourse analysis, first of all, of the discipline. And then from that develops a kind of normative agenda of selecting, filtering out of these observations the pertinent tendencies, the permanent communication structures, the variable communication structures which have been evolving, etc. And it forges and converges towards a statement and position how to move forward. The medium of architecture is one of those. So there is, at the same time, there is the attempt to make this digestible by pulling together theories of theses out of the discourse. And I might just read a few. Thesis 1 is that the phenomenon of architecture can be most adequately grasped if it is analyzed as an autonomous network or autopoietic system of communications. So I'm not talking about architecture just as a collection of buildings or fine buildings. I'm not talking about it as a profession as such, or just a practice. I'm not talking about it only as an academic discipline, but how all these activities join together to create a system of communications. Thesis 4 I just pulled out, there is no architecture without theory. Thesis 6 contains the notion that resolute autonomy, or what I call self-referential closure, is a prerequisite of architecture's effectiveness within an increasingly complex and dynamic societal environment. So there's an interesting notion of self-enclosed autonomy of the discipline. It just means that we, as architects and as a discourse as a whole, need to define the purposes which guide us, the proper conceptual structures and modes of arguments which are legitimate and meaningful to us, what tasks to focus on and how to pursue them. Nobody but the kind of network of communications which we constitute determines this, and there is no longer in contemporary society, for sure, some kind of other authority we can appeal to which would instruct architecture with respect to the built environment and its evolution. Neither politics, nor paying clients, nor science, nor morality. We have the burden as a collective to determine the way forward. That's what I mean by autonomy here. Autonomy to adapt to an environment and stay relevant with an environment. And that is not guaranteed if we get it wrong. I also discovered or saying that only by differentiating the avant-garde as specific subsystem can contemporary architecture actively participate in the evolution of society. So I believe that institutions like this one here and the AA and other places, which seem to be one step removed from the burdens of delivering state-of-the-art solutions here and now and every day, is a necessary condition for architecture to rethink itself continuously and upgrade itself continuously. Thesis 10 suggests that in a society without control center, architecture has to regulate itself and maintain its own mechanisms of evolution that allow it to stay adapted within the ecology of evolving societal subsystems. And what these subsystems are and the notion of society, I will explain a bit more later, which is underlying this discourse. So there can be no external determination imposed upon architecture, neither by political bodies nor by paying clients, except in the negative, trivial sense of disruption. Yes, they can stop our project. Maybe they can clamp down and prevent permission, but they obviously cannot constructively intervene and interfere. And that is the same with the other so-called subsystems of society, like the legal system, science, the art system, etc. They're all kind of self-regulating discourses. Thesis 16, suggesting that avant-garde styles are design research programs. So if I talk about style and use that concept, I'm not necessarily alluding to all its nuances and connotations, and make an effort to redefine style, to make it a valid category of contemporary discourse. Because I feel to just let it drop to the side would be an impoverishment of contemporary discourse, and also considering that the notion of style is one of those few notions which is meaningful beyond the confines of architectural discourse. The world outside, for the world outside, it's the primary category of understanding architecture, and we need to engage with that. So avant-garde styles, and all styles start as avant-garde styles, are design research programs. They start as progressive design research programs, and parametricism is in that phase. They mature to become productive dogmas, and that also happened to modernism. And there's productivity in the ability to routinize, dogmatize insights for quick and rapid dissemination and execution. And obviously they end up as degenerate dogmas. All styles have this kind of trajectory. Thesis 17, aesthetic values encapsulate condensed collective experience within useful dogmas. Their inherent inertia implies that they progress via revolution rather than evolution. So thinking about aesthetic values having kind of condensed rationality, but obviously that is transitory and shifts with historical progress. You need to relearn your aesthetic sensibilities to have those which are productive and vital and allow you to exist and be productive in contemporary life. And the same goes actually for moral sensibilities you might have. And I'm arguing, for instance, that minimalist sensibilities, which I know what they feel like and might still have, got to be fought and suppressed, because they certainly don't allow you to adapt to contemporary life. Thesis 19, architecture depends upon its medium, and in an enormous way, and parametricism is very much also a product and fruit and involved in the development of the medium of architecture, architectural communication, the special medium, which is the medium of the drawing, becoming the digital model, becoming parametric model and the kind of network of scripts. Architecture depends on this in the same way that the economy depends on money, the politics depends on power. It sustains a new plane of communication that depends upon the credibility of the medium and remains inherently vulnerable to inflationary tendencies. If you overdo your kind of make-believe renderings, they're not backed up by reality, your animation, etc., there's a kind of danger of inflating and losing credibility. But without this kind of level of compelling medium for you, you would never be able to convince yourself, nor anybody else, to project complex, large-scale project into a distant future and coalesce enormous amount of resources and people to believe in a kind of coordinated effort. And that was, in fact, very, very important, but also the medium, of course, needs to, with the complexity of tasks and agendas, needs to upgrade. The same happened with money. Money is no longer coinage, moved into paper money, it moved into electronic money, into all sorts of complex systems, and the same is with the medium of architecture. The medium of administrative power has also benefited from the microelectronic revolution in terms of administering, controlling, connecting, and directing. Each of these social subsystems has such a specialized medium. I'm just picking out one more thesis, thesis 23. Radical innovation presupposes newness. Newness is first of all just otherness. The new is produced by blind mechanisms rather than creative thought. Strategic selection is required to secure communicative continuity and adaptive pertinence. Okay, so this just to make you curious to go on to Amazon and pre-order the book. Now I want to talk a little bit about the theoretical sources which allow me to present a comprehensive unified and work out a comprehensive unified theory of architecture with confidence and conviction. And of course, to do that, one of the key things you have to grasp and understand is the societal function or the raison d'être of architecture in society and in this world, why it came into being, why it took certain form and moved to certain developments, and what is the best bet of staying relevant and continuing to play an important role. And for that you need to have some kind of sense of the overall social process and its workings. And for the, I would say, the first decade of my architectural life, I started in the early 80s. I was trying to look at Marxism and historical materialism as that kind of overarching theoretical edifice within which and through which to think what's going on in architecture. Just on the side, just thinking about back the 80s, and when I went into architecture at the University of Stuttgart, I was joining a kind of the late modernist period, people being very convinced still of modernism. I was still high-tech. Foster Rogers was still a very, very prominent and going tendency. I was into it quite quickly. 1 or 2 years later into my studies, I discovered postmodernism, the writing of Venturi, Jenks, the language of postmodern architecture. And so I switched and changed, and the university, in fact, and changed, and that was the years when the shift happened, a little bit later than here, of course. Then a few years later, there was a radical shift into deconstructivism. And it seemed in this period that is every 2-3 years, kind of, there could be a revolution in style, in paradigm, in outlook, in values. And I think that period left a mark on some people's consciousness as if was the way it was to be. And also you had quite soon this kind of pluralism of styles. And it seemed as if this kind of monolithic, cumulative trajectory of modernism which lasted for 50 years is some kind of a past era, and we're now living in this kind of world of continuous flux and splintering and fragmenting trajectories and ever-changing values, but that is a historical illusion. I will argue that later. Anyway, going back to the background theoretical horizon, let's say, within which one can inscribe a credible theory of architecture in contemporary society. I am moved on to a certain extent. I discovered another powerful theoretical system, which is the system of Niklas Luhmann, social systems theory. There's a lot of coincidence, or I would say similarities between Luhmann's system and Marx and Marxism in terms of the comprehensiveness of the ambition of understanding social life, history. There's similarities in terms of the fundamental, say, functionalist model of explanation of what's going on, always asking the raison d'être. Why does something persist and grow? What is its function in an overall process, rather than asking only what is the origin, what are the causes, what are the influences for something to come into existence. Just a quick sketch. His fundamental premise is that all social phenomena or events depend on systems of communications. So there is a step back from the Marxist materialism, and it's a kind of abstraction to a certain extent, but one which I think is perhaps plausible. You always have to abstract, and to focus on communications is, I think, interesting, because just to have that reflection, if you think about in your life and everybody's lives, processes and ongoings, where are the bottlenecks, where's the crux of your problems, your issues, what do you cope with, is always social systems, your ability to communicate within them, position within them. Even the physical world only gets to you through, and you could kind of fight back physical issues through systems of communication, through patterns of communication. So if you're struck by illness, your main problem will be whether you have health insurance, whether you have people you can communicate to, whether you kind of embedded in systems of communications with rights and ability to speak and communicate. If you want to traverse physical space, your issue will be whether you have the money, the airline ticket. The bottleneck will be traffic jam and other people's attempts to travel, security controls at airports, etc. So if you think about it, where is the if the environment, you protect it if you have the ability to buy a hotel room, an apartment, switch on the heater, etc., paying your bills. These are it's always communications which structure anybody's interface with the physical world and anything else. So it's, I think it's a plausible. And if you think about us, as it were, in inverted commas, constructing projects, it is only through communications, whether they're drawings, contracts, phone calls, emails, communications, that what drives this, runs this world. Everything is going through that needle's eye. Luhmann's kind of philosophy of history is different from Marx's and Hegel's. Marx's was quite different from Hegel's, but I still insist you got to have a philosophy of history, a theory of historical development. And his way of looking at it is that in terms of modes of social or societal differentiation, that's let's say the criterion of epochal demarcation. When we move from one to another epoch in terms of societal development. Segmentation is simply when tribes proliferate as one tribe next to another tribe, next to another tribe. They don't build up larger complexes. They're just equal next to each other. And within the tribe there is also equality nearly from one family to the next. fundamental principle is one of reciprocity. This is the normal, the probable, the natural way how community, society first emerges. A certain moment in history, there's some kind of another mode of differentiation comes in, center-periphery differentiation. One tribe gains ascendance and the other ones become kind of satellite to it. Town, countryside is a kind of center-periphery dialectic. All of these segmentation still exists, of course. The units in an architecture school are segmentary differentiated. They're just equals. They're same, next to same, next to same. Center periphery still exists. There's certain history, but what is the dominant mode of differentiation is interesting. So then, at a certain stage, a stratification comes in. That's the era of feudalism, where everything, the most important issue is in which strata you're kind of located within a society. It's not individuals, it's families. You're located into strata. And this concerns every aspect of your life. If you're noble, you always have the advantage with respect to all aspects of life. You're able to sleep with the wives of your subordinates. You control them in terms of power and politics. You control the economy. You control knowledge through religion and the clerical hierarchy, etc. So, and as stratification devolves, it becomes ever more nuanced and fine-graded, but issues of status and rank are predominant wherever you go, wherever you step, whatever circumstances. The room you step into, the most important question in that era is the ranking order. That determines everything else. And these rank positions are universally applicable. In this kind of era, questions of priority also in the intellectual life are very important. In this era, if you would think about the arts, the first question you would have to ask, what is the ranking order of the arts? Which is the primary art? Is it painting? Is it sculpture? Is it architecture? Everybody has their own idea about it, but the notion here is there must be an answer to this question, etc. Of course, this order has disappeared. That's meaningless. Nobody here in the school or everywhere else entering a discussion with an architecture, it matters whether he is a noble, he is rich, poor, old, young. Whatever other authority he might have is irrelevant, and that's in all situations of life today. They're organized in a different way. They're organized in terms of functional differentiation. So now all discourses, the primary mode of differentiation is functional differentiation. And the most important kind of level, this is what Luhmann calls the great function systems of society. And society is now termed, since modernity, functionally differentiated society. Now you have these autonomous discourses or systems of communication like politics, law, economy, science, education, health, mass media, and art. And they are autonomous, as hinted at earlier. A politician has no way of influencing, no say in terms of scientific truth. Also, the legal issues of legality have nothing to say with respect to scientific knowledge. So there is no, the economy is separated out from politics and has its own autonomous domain and communication system based on money and exchange in the market. And the reverse is also, science cannot influence politics. It can kind of deliver knowledge, but what is to be done with that knowledge is a matter of the political discourse. And the same would go with art and mass media. The beautiful cannot be scientifically determined, etc. And in this kind of picture of society, which I'm just very, very briefly sketched here, Luhmann has in fact written monographic analyses, if you like, comprehensive discourse analyses of all these social subsystems, but he didn't write and didn't take note of architecture. He in fact fitted architecture anachronistically into the art system, but didn't really talk much about it. So that's, and I've been reading this guy's works for about 10, 15 years, and more it dawned on me that architecture could be theorized in that same way and building on the insights. So I'm saying architecture and design is one of those great function systems of contemporary society or functionally differentiated society. Just a few more pointers, what that might mean. Luhmann is discovering a series of important processes which determine these different systems within the era of modernity. So the economy is emerging as a market-oriented or liberal economy, the liberalization of the economy is the kind of pertinent way for the economy to become an autopoietic system. The political system has been evolving and succeeding through democratization, and only through democratization it becomes a truly autopoietic, self-referentially closed system. The legal system found in its kind of autonomy and forward drive through positivism, rather than a kind of natural law or God-given law kind of discourse. Art discovered the self-programming of art and Romanticism. And all of these mechanisms, liberalism of the economy, democratization, positivism, etc., means that these systems, through these mechanisms, become autonomous and adaptive to each other. They become versatile, innovative, progressive, and ever-evolving. And the equivalent in architecture and all these processes or establishment of these kind of pertinent systems happened somewhere between 1800 and 1900. And the concept of space, or the spatialization of architecture, I think, is the equivalent of the democratization of the political system, liberalization of the economy, etc. Just a hint. What else I think was interesting and very powerful about this working with Luhmann is that as Luhmann is analyzing these different function systems, he realizes that they are parallelisms. They each are unique, but they each face kind of parallel or comparative problems. How to demarcate themselves, how to cohere themselves around an elemental type of operation, how to represent within themselves the difference between them and the environment. And there's a series of notions, and I can't go in detail through them, where he discovers that each of these systems has a binary code, elite distinctions, programs which elaborate how the code values will be used. They all have their specific medium. I was mentioning the drawing digital model for architecture, money for the economy, etc. Of course, they all have a societal function, and this one is a unique, singular, exclusive function which in fact, acts as a kind of evolutionary attractor for the differentiation of that and autonomization of that respective system. And this unique and distinct function is kind of unfolding in a series of tasks. And also, the last point maybe I mentioned that each of these systems found itself and projects itself forward only through something which Luhmann called self-descriptions. That means that within this discourse there are great treatises, written accounts of trying to think through and argue through the function and purpose and destiny and raison d'etre of each of the function systems. So you find that in each of these systems you find reflection theories. So the political system exists with political theory. The legal system developed in a kind of together with an incorporating jurisprudence. Sciences developed together with epistemology, philosophy of science. The education system has pedagogy, and architecture has architectural theory, but only of a certain deep and comprehensive kind is what counts as self-descriptions. And in the book, in volume 2, I'm going through some of them. Alberti's 10 Books of Architecture is one of them. Durand's lectures on architecture, perhaps for the era of neoclassicism. Le Corbusier's Towards the New Architecture for modernism. And the Autopoiesis of Architecture for contemporary, for our times. That's the ambition for parametricism. Last slide for this kind of book promotion, if you like. It is interesting that in working through this kind of tenth volume of Luhmann's work, if you like, the unwritten volume, and he knew nothing of architecture, by the way. It led to a kind of further level of systematization of what I've been reading out of these works. So I've been kind of restructuring Luhmann's edifice in writing a kind of a further part and systematizing further. So Luhmann never produced such a matrix, but here I'm trying to list the function systems on one line and all the key discursive structures which we can identify in each of them. Type of self-description, so-called lead distinction. I'll just reveal this. The lead distinction of architecture is form versus function. The founding moment. In Alberti you find that. You find it in all major self-descriptions, and these are all permanent communication structures of architecture. And that coincides, for instance, in the legal system is the distinction of norm versus fact structures the totality of that discourse. The economy is always revolving around the distinction of price versus value. The sciences, theory versus evidence, etc. And I also discovered that this lead distinction, in fact, and that Luhmann didn't systematize it to this extent, is representing the distinction of the system against its environment, the environment being the totality of society, within itself through this lead distinction. So there's a kind of re-entry of the system-environment distinction within the system becomes the lead distinction. So the moment of form, through the moment of form, architecture represents itself to itself in distinction to function, which is the external reference, the world reference. You can think that through always. Norm versus fact. Fact is the external environment represented against the norm where the legal system describes itself. Theory versus evidence. Evidence is the world reference. Theory is the internal reference. Price versus value. Price is the internal reference. Value is the external reference, etc. Just a glimpse of And it's been kind of a creative puzzle-solving exercise where I've gone through many different versions and to identify what the respective structures in architecture are, which coincide with these other structures. But in the end, I get the feeling that there's a kind of coherent picture emerging, which allows me to take a position with respect to all these partial theories which I've been kind of developing over the years. Okay. How are we with time? I'm just showing a few pictures of Rome, just perhaps to as a reminder that there's a certain credibility. In terms of realizing projects which follow the principles I'm talking about, and that these principles make sense and succeed and are accepted as developing contemporary institutions. Just a few hints on what is interesting about Rome. The Rome project is a kind of field project. It has a very, very stringent formalism. But at the same time, it is very capable of adapting, affiliating to context in terms of continuing field conditions, aligning to an urban grid on this side, aligning to a second urban grid on this side, incorporating existing architectures, managing to create a coherent space around a corner in an L shape. So it does a lot of difficult things with ease, I would argue, and elegance. So again, there's even the kind of affiliation to the river as kind of remnants. Again, here the strong alignments with the context. Some of these going right through the building. There's a sense of bringing disparate elements under a single kind of formalism of these flow line, irrigating the space with display walls and linear elements. One of the ambitions is the moments of deep visual penetration and the kind of legibility, transparency of a complex organization. The main entrance, some daylight marking it, deep vistas into another public space, terraced gallery overhead, so connections into the interior and later on back from the interior to the exterior. A kind of central communication hub where again ramps and staircases are following a kind of formal language of walls and ribs into creating something which is coherent. And that's as a precondition for generating an overall complexity without creating visual chaos. The avoidance of corner to reduce kind of visual complexity to establish organizational complexity, maintaining legibility. The incorporation of the existing structure. Moments of calm and quieting down into this space which is contained but ever drifting forward, never ending in a continuous loop. And secondary moments of connection where lines cross, vertical connections happen kind of diagrammatic logic of that, bundling of lines which at the point of turning are able to change density. And the attempt to kind of reveal deep vistas, glass floor here for an over third level gallery. Again, kind of moments of quiet, but this ever continuing drift of space is this kind of field condition where the segmentation into discrete spaces is avoided. But as you move forward, there's continuously new elements being thrown into the view and into the space you occupy, and behind you things drop off. Moments of trying to allow kind of vistas across, outside and back to the building. These kind of moment of interest where you have kind of deep layering of space in all directions, all dimensions. Where you have views back into the gallery, into the public spaces, to the exterior, etc. The final loop to the top and looking back. So although a kind of early work, the principles of having no longer this modernist mode of a handful of discrete objects composed into an artifact by the kind of proliferation of lines, bundlings, converging and departing from another, creating a kind of field space, kind of texture. That's the attempt here. So it is a kind of early parametricist project. And I'm going to show works of the Haidid architects, the AA Design Research Lab, the Vienna University of Applied Arts, and Innsbruck Institute for Experimental Architecture. That's the material I have, and it's already running into thousands of slides. But this not to say that this work is in any way exclusive to us. And as I said earlier, in the 80s, it seemed to me as every 2-3 years something else is coming along and I have to shift direction. When we had AA DRL 10-year celebrations 2-3 years ago, I realized that we didn't have to shift direction. We were just homing on the same principles, same values, just getting deeper and deeper and more expansive with respect to type of project, taking on urban projects, taking on interiors, taking on all sorts of programs, moving from mere geometry to involving structure, aperture, program, materiality, color. The tools were evolving, becoming more sophisticated, but it is an experience of deepening, cumulative, directed research. That is an experience which we shared with many, many others, and many of them are sitting here. So I'm talking about a spontaneously emerging convergence, which is compelling. Everybody wants to be, well, in inverted commas, everybody. Many, many young architects in particular, worldwide, want to be part of it, want to work on this and nothing else. And I think that's a very healthy sniffing of where the vitality is moving. It means something at that scale, what's happening, and we need to understand. That's what I'm trying to understand. What does it mean? What it means, why it is like this, why it should be like this, and why one should promote it to be going on further. It's not a fashion. Styles have nothing to do with fashion. Cycles. As Mies said, you can't invent a new architecture every Monday morning. Of course, the crisis of modernism meant that this couldn't continue, but we found a new kind of moment of conversion and cumulative progress. Just some of the writings. So maybe just the definition of parametricism. First of all, just a kind of conceptual definition, if you like. All the elements of architecture have become parametrically malleable, and that's kind of fundamental and profound. The advantage of this is the intensification of relations, both internally within a design project, a building, and externally of that project with its context and surroundings. Now, this is a very fundamental ontological shift with respect to the base components and primitives of constituting an architecture. For the previous 2,000 years, if you like, all the way including modernism, because this is from Le Corbusier, architecture was working with these Platonic solids, these rigid hermetic geometric figures, and just composing them. And that was, of course, modernism allowed to stretch proportions, was able to give up locking these into symmetries, and had instead a kind of dynamic equilibrium and more freedom. It moved from edifice to space, with all the advantages of abstraction and versatility that entails. But in terms of the base primitive, it was this and nothing else. Now, if you look at the kind of primitives we're working with, it's a totally different world. Splines, blobs, nerves, particles, organized by scripts. And this is the moment, I think, started with deconstructism to a certain extent. I think this was blobs, which Greg was talking about, 94, 95. This is a drawing from Columbia University when we were teaching there in 93, creating these kind of dynamically entangled and cross-inflecting textures, if you like, and fields. Of course, this was also the beginning of introducing certain computational mechanisms. So instead of drawing with ruler and compass, rigid lines and rigid figures, we work with dynamical systems. That's a new ontology which cannot but leave a profound, radically transformative mark on what we do, and if we succeed, and I have no doubt, will change the physiognomy of this planet and its built environment just the way modernism was able to do for 50 years in the 20th century. I think that the fact that the recession for the last 2 years put a bit of a damper on this should not be misunderstood as a kind of failure or refutation of this kind of work. In fact, all the recession meant that some of the, in terms of lines and surfaces, etc., we have this new ontology, but that investment continues in digital technology, fabrication systems, etc., and the prohibitiveness of cost aspects is kind of more and more diminishing as a factor. It doesn't stand in the way of universalizing these principles. That's the way we do urbanism now. So the thesis is clear: parametricism is the great new style after modernism. I'm saying that because postmodernism and deconstructivism I'm considering just as transitional styles or transitional episodes. I think that architectural innovation or history proceeds via the succession of styles, and that could not be otherwise. These are the great paradigms or research programs by which architecture redefines itself Yeah, as I said, postmodernism and deconstructivism are temporary phenomena, a decade each. Parametricism is already kind of 15 years down the line. Design research programs. What do I mean by that? It is to establish the conditions for collective design research. You need to agree on fundamentals to add up into an overall research project. If you are fighting over fundamentals every time to make a step, start a new project, and you cannot progress. I mean, here I'm making a drawing, not on Luhmann so much, but a very, very strong analogy with the philosophy of science as it was projected by Thomas Kuhn, the paradigm shifts, and in particular Lakato's theory of scientific research programs. Again, the same is here. And a science is founded or refounded with certain paradigmatic categories, principles, anticipations, intuitions about how a science could progress. And on that basis, after a kind of revolutionary period of paradigm shift, a new paradigm or research program has to kind of emerge and win out of a competitive battle, and then kind of recohere, hopefully, cumulative research. And that implies that you are formulating pertinent desires. What is it about? What are we trying to do? Framing and posing problems. What kind of problems are we addressing and working through? And also, critically, we're strategically constraining the solution space. That meaning we are identifying these problems, but we're trying to solve them by means of parametric systems, for instance, by means of exploiting the power of malleability in the elements, etc. So I can't draw out the analogy, but there are very strong analogies in science. For instance, the Newtonian or the physics under Newton set up a certain set of principles by which now every phenomenon was investigated and probed and modeled. And as you go from problem to problem, the same principles are hold steady. Otherwise, there is no testing, no research. So it's very important that, first of all, innovation requires this collective effort, which the style delivers, and that this implies a kind of convergence upon certain key conditions, or this convergence is the condition of any progress. And we should think of the history of architecture in terms of another analogy, cycles of innovation and shifts between revolutionary periods where the paradigm is no longer working, society have moved elsewhere. That was the late 60s, 70s, early 80s. At these periods, you really couldn't go on after Pruitt-Igoe was exploded. The principles you were relying on were exhausted, lost credibility. Social life moved out of these greenfield sites back into historic cities because nothing else was there. That's why SAIC was founded also, because the old university way of doing things couldn't continue, was bankrupt. You simply didn't know how to proceed, what to do. You were blocked. The tools were bankrupt. At that point, you got to be very open. Everybody's voice, critique, idea comes forward. The old authorities are no longer meaningful. It creates a certain cast of characters also. And it requires that sense of freewheeling, freedom of brainstorming, it draws in philosophers the most fundamental questions of asked and probed, and where to go is unclear. And I think we had that period, and it takes time. But I feel that it's interesting that, philosophy has receded. We have reached a different stage. We're no longer in that era. We have drawn our conclusions. We have learned our lessons. We have internalized new forms of thinking and argumentation, new values and new philosophies, and now we have to draw the consequences through practical forging and developing a new architecture. And you can't, and I have no patience. I mean, in inverted commas, of course, and every new generation has to relearn and understand the raison d'etre of what we're doing. But it doesn't mean that what we're doing is up for discursive destruction or disposition every second year once more. What belongs to this as well is that at the early stages of a kind of new convergence, I think you have to live with a lot of failures, a lot of difficulties, a lot of implausibilities. That's why we need the avant-garde, where there is methodical tolerance, where there is dry runs, where there is experiments, where there's manifesto projects. And you can't expect to immediately compete with a kind of mainstream state of the art. And you have to stick to, and that's very important, obstinately to your principles, and don't allow pragmatic concerns for you to fall back on old models, old solutions which are easy and accepted. You got to go the difficult way. You got to go the consistent way, the dogmatic way. And that's what Newton did also.